Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Theo Engelen. I'm the rector of the Radboud University. It's on behalf of this university, and especially on behalf of the Soeterbeeck Programma of this university, it is my pleasure to welcome you, especially Professor Jane Goodall, at this special session for which so many of you came to this venue. Introducing Jane Goodall is like explaining that every spring is followed by summer. She's so known by all of you that it is not necessary to give a long explanation of what she did. So, some small introductory words. Jane Goodall is a British anthropologist and biologist specialized in ethology and primatology. Of course, we know her best from a study on the social life of chimpansees that spanned more than 40 years. Since 1960, she studied groups of chimpanzees in the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania. More than any other person, she changed our view on chimpanzees, our closest relatives in nature. She demonstrated the individuality of primates and the complexity of their interaction. Engaging in such an intimate way with nature cannot but enforce the care for our environment. And thus, in 1977, the Jane Goodall Institute was founded with the goal to preserve nature, especially, of course, preserve the habitat of chimpanzees. For this and many other initiatives, Jane Goodall was appointed as one of the peace ambassadors of the United Nations. Relentlessly, our guest travels all over the world to propagate her concern for the environment. The core value of the Institute and of the woman who gave her name to that institute are summed up as follows. We strive to respect, nourish, and protect all living things. People, animals, and the environment are all interconnected. We believe that knowledge leads to understanding, and that understanding will encourage us to take action. We believe that every individual has the ability to make a positive difference. We believe that flexibility and open-mindedness are essential to enable us to respond to a changing world. We require integrity and compassion in all that we do and say. Imagine, John Lennon would say, if you would all do this. Today, Professor Goodall will lecture on sowing the seeds of hope, elaborating on her own life course and on the experience of conservation, the importance of conservation. The lecture will last until approximately 4 o'clock. Afterwards, Lisa Douland of the Soeterbeeck Programma will guide the discussion between Professor Goodall and the audience. And finally, there is the opportunity to have your copies of Professor Goodall's books signed by the author.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I can't actually see most of you very well now because of the bright lights, but I looked before, so I know that all the way around are people. Thank you. I want to start with my traditional greeting. Some of you have heard it before. If you have, you could answer me, but it's the call that you would hear if you came with me to Gombe National Park and climbed up the hills in the morning, the call of a chimpanzee announcing, "Here I am, where are you?" This is me, this is Jane. Anyone out there? You see? Good, well done. It's because the chimpanzees don't travel around like most of the monkeys and apes in stable troops or groups, but travel around by themselves in small family groups, small groups of males, mixed, sometimes big excited gatherings if there's some delicious food ripe in one particular place, or if there's a sexually attractive female. And some, by the way, are much more attractive than others, just like people. So I actually want to start by, so that call is important because this is how they maintain contact, like between family members, make that call, listen, and because each one has an individual voice, you know who's calling. So it's a very useful sort of call. But I want to go back to the beginning of my life because it has certain messages in, particularly for young people today. And I was fortunate enough to have a very remarkable mother. She played, as you will hear, a most important role in my life and in helping me to become who I am today. She supported my love of animals, which began when I was very small and did things like taking earthworms to bed. I was only 1.5, and she didn't get angry at me. She just said they needed the earth, and we took them back into the garden. And then comes this famous story when I was 4.5 years old. I know many of you have heard it before, but I tell it again, because we went to stay from living in London, in the city. We went to stay for 2 weeks on a farm in the country for a holiday. So for an animal-loving little girl, being face-to-face with cows and pigs and horses was really magical. I was given a job to help collect the hen's eggs. And apparently I started asking, but where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a hole big enough. Nobody answered me to my satisfaction, I suppose. And I decided I would have to find out for myself. So when I saw, and this is what I remember, seeing a hen, I can see her now if I shut my eyes, walking up this sloping plank into the little hen house where they slept at night. There were about 6 of those in the farmyard, and there were nest boxes round the edge. So I thought, she's going to lay an egg, and I crawled after her. Squawks of fear, she flew out. And again, 4.5, but I distinctly remember thinking, well, no hen will lay an egg here now because it's a dangerous place, and hiding in an empty hen house and waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, a hen came in and I saw this magical performance. So what I didn't know is that by this time, all the family were really worried, where was this little girl? And they were searching. And my mother sees me rushing towards the house all covered in straw. Many mothers would have got angry just from fear. How dare you go off without telling us? Don't you dare do it again. And all that excitement would have been crushed. And the reason I tell the story and tell it again is because if you look back on that story, it is the making of a little scientist, the curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience. It was all there when I was 4.5. And a different sort of mother might have crushed the makings of that little scientist. So I was lucky. And I was lucky that she helped me find the books that I wanted to read, books about animals. No TV back then when I was growing up. World War II was raging. And so I spent a lot of time with books. And yes, I did love books about animals. Most of the books came from the library. We had very little money. But I loved books, and I would spend hours in a little second-hand bookshop with the books piled higgledy-piggledy on the floor. And I would crawl about among these books. And one day when I was 10 years old, I found a little book, which I still have, and it was called Tarzan of the Apes. I took it home, I read it from cover to cover, and of course I fell passionately in love with this glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do but marry the wrong Jane? At any rate, that was when my dream was born. Of course, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but I dreamed that I would grow up, go to Africa, live with animals, and write books about them. That was what I wanted to do. And of course, everybody laughed at me. War-torn England, very little money. Africa was still the dark continent. We didn't know much about it. And it was very far away. There were no planes going back and forth with tourists, and we didn't have any money. And worst of all, I was just a girl. Girls didn't have those opportunities back then. And so, Jane, dream about something you can achieve. Forget this nonsense about Africa. But not my mother. She said, and that's why I go back again and again to these early days, because of their message to young people today. She said to me, Jane, if you really want something, you're going to have to work very hard and take advantage of opportunity and never give up. That's the message that I share around the world with young people, and I'll come back to that presently. At any rate, when I left school, there was no money for university. And again, it was my mother. She said, well, do a secretarial course. We've just got money for that. Maybe you can get a job in Africa. And so I did that. I was actually working in London with a documentary film unit, which taught me so much about filmmaking, which has been really useful to me in my life. And then a letter from a school friend inviting me for a holiday to Kenya. There was the opportunity. Left London, couldn't save money there, still didn't have much money. Went home, worked as a waitress for several months. It wasn't a smart, fancy hotel, but a place where people came and stayed for a week's holiday by the seaside. This is Bournemouth, by the way. And so eventually I had saved up enough money with my small wages and the tips that I could collect. And it was finally enough for a return fare to Africa by boat, because in those days that was the cheapest. Planes were kind of rare back then. And so I was 23 years old when I waved goodbye to family, friends, and country and set off on this amazing adventure. I mean, can you imagine setting off alone, 23? Well, these days it's normal for 23-year-old young women to go off on adventures like this. Back then it wasn't. And many people thought my mother was irresponsible and told her she shouldn't let me go. But luckily she didn't listen to them. And so I stayed with my friend. And you know, the very first morning, somebody came to fetch me excitedly from my room, and there, just outside the front door of this house, was a huge leopard paw print. So the leopard had been right close to the house. It was really exciting. I stayed with my friend for a while. I'd been taught never overstay your welcome. I got a boring old job in Nairobi in Kenya. And then I heard about Dr. Louis Leakey. And somebody said, Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. I went to the Natural History Museum. He was curator. He asked me zillions of questions. That led to him giving me a job as his secretary, I suppose, his assistant secretary. And it was magical because the most fascinating people came through the museum. He spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of early man. And so all these people would come in and they'd bring fragments of bone from here and a human tooth from there, but they also brought in a lot of animals and stories about animals. And Leakey allowed me to accompany him and his wife and one other young English girl for 3 months in the summer, searching for fossils in the now famous Olduvai Gorge, where many human remains have been found, but back then only the remains of prehistoric animals. And so all the animals were there, and it was the most amazing, incredible adventure. And Gillian and I walking out on the plains every evening. One evening we met a rhino. One evening it was a young male lion, totally curious, followed us longer than this whole auditorium, I would say. And I think it was that evening around the fire that Louis decided I was the person he'd been looking for to study chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, along with bonobo, are closest living relatives in the animal kingdom today. Why did Louis Leakey want somebody to study chimpanzees? Because he believed that about 6 million years ago, there was an ape-like, human-like creature, and from that ape-like, human-like creature two lines evolved. One led to the great apes, and the other led to us. So he wanted to find out how chimpanzees behaved in the wild. We didn't know about bonobos back then. They were called pygmy chimpanzees, and nobody really knew much about them. Otherwise, Lewis might have sent me to study them, but as it was, I went off to Gombe National Park. It took a year for him to, to get the money, because who was going to give money for this ridiculous, stupid idea of sending a young girl from England who didn't know anything, who'd never been to college, into the wilds, which is what women didn't do, to try and study chimpanzees who might be dangerous, and there were leopards and buffalo. Louis Leakey was crazy, but eventually a wealthy American businessman said, all right, here's money for 6 months. We'll see how she does. Then the next problem was the British authorities, because back then Tanzania of today was Tanganyika, a British protectorate. And they eventually said, oh, I suppose she can come, but not alone, she must bring a companion. And again, it was the same amazing mother who volunteered to come. She came for 4 of those 6 months. She set up a little clinic, not a medical person herself, but her brother was a surgeon, her sister was a physiotherapist. She had simple aspirins and bandages and things like that. She spent hours with sick people who came with terrible wounds and things. She made some amazing cures. We discovered later she was known as a white witch doctor. And at any rate, she really started me off super well with relationship with the local people, the fishermen along the beach. And they came from the neighboring villages. And she also boosted my morale when I got back in the evening depressed, because the chimpanzees had never seen anything like a white ape before. And they're very conservative. And they would take one look at this weird creature and vanish into the forest. And as the weeks turned into months, I knew if I didn't see something exciting before the money ran out, that would be the end. So she was there to say, but Jane, you know, you're learning how they make sleeping nests up in the trees at night, bending over the branches. You're learning the kind of foods they're eating. And she said, you know, you sit up there on your peak and you see the kind of groups that are out there. You see how sometimes they meet up. You're learning some of the calls. You're learning more than you think you are. How sad that it was just after she left that I saw the breakthrough observation, that never-to-be-forgotten day when I saw the one chimpanzee who'd begun to lose his fear of me before the others, whom I had named David Greybeard because of the white beard on his chin. He was a very, very good-looking chimpanzee, and there really are differences. And on this particular morning, I saw him crouched over a termite mound, and I saw him pushing pieces of grass, pulling them out, biting off the termites. I saw him break off a leafy twig, and before he could use that as a tool, he had to strip off the leaves. So David Greybeard, in front of my very eyes, was using and making tools. So why was that exciting? It wouldn't be today. But back then, it was thought that humans and only humans could use and make tools. We were defined as man the toolmaker. And so it was really exciting, and it was this observation that encouraged the National Geographic to come in with funding when that 6 months' money ran out. So thank you, David Greybeard. You know, one of the people I thank throughout my life is, of course, my mother and Louis Leakey, but David Greybeard too. And after we got the geographic money, there I was on my own with, well, we had a cook and a boatman, local people. But basically, all day and every evening, I was on my own, writing up the day's notes, and really, because of David, getting to know more and more about this community of chimpanzees. So you can imagine, David is sitting with a group of chimps. I approach. They're ready to run away as usual. But David is sitting there calmly And I could see them looking from him to me and back again. And I suppose they decided, well, she can't be so frightening after all. And so it was as though David introduced me to his friends in the forest. And I got to know them. You've been seeing footage of those days. Some of those chimpanzees I knew so well, like Goliath, who was the top-ranking male, and Mike, who took over that position using empty kerosene, paraffin cans, displaying across towards the other males who ran away from him. So I was learning about old Flo and her family, and timid Ollie with her goiter and her lonely daughter, and Passion, who turned out with her daughter to be cannibals and actually kill and eat infants of other females. Shocking discovery, but fascinating too. And you saw the fighting between neighboring communities and, of course, the tool using, not just fishing for termites, but scrumpling leaves to make a sponge to get water out of a hollow in a tree that they couldn't reach with their lips, using rocks as missiles to throw, sticks as clubs, and various other ways of using tools. And I was learning more and more about how like us chimpanzees actually are, all their different personalities, the emotions that they show so clearly of happiness, sadness. You saw little Flint dying of grief. And more fascinating as the months went by. I had a letter from Louis Leakey when I'd been at Gombe something over a year, and he told me that he would not always be around to get money for me. I would have to learn to get money for myself. I would never succeed, he said, unless I had a degree. He got me a place in Cambridge University to do a PhD. I hadn't done a BA or an MA. I had to go straight for a PhD. Some students have said, oh, how lucky. You know, it wasn't. I promise you it wasn't lucky. First of all, I was sure, and I think I'm right, that a lot of students resented it. Who is this woman coming in? She hasn't had to do the slogging work we did, and she gets to do a PhD. And in England, you don't have to go to courses, you just write up your thesis, so I never got to know any of them very well. But even worse was the attitude of the professors. I was a bit scared of them. I didn't know anything about science except, you know, high school biology, and not even zoology. They didn't teach that at the school I was at. And so when they tackled me on my study, telling me I'd done everything wrong, it was a shock. I mean, you gave your chimpanzees names. Don't you know that's not good science? They should have numbers. And you talk about them having personalities. You talk about them having minds able to think. You talk about them having emotions. Those things are unique to the human animal. That's what I was told. But fortunately, I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child. And that teacher had taught me very clearly that I was right and the professors were wrong. For all their erudite knowledge, they were wrong. That teacher, oh, many of you know a teacher like this. It was my dog, Rusty. You can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog or a cat, a rabbit, a guinea pig, a rat, a horse. I don't care what it is. If you share your life in a meaningful way with an animal, you know those professors were wrong. So I was able to have the courage of my convictions, which my mother had taught me I always should, as long as I listened to the other side first. And I was also fortunate in having a fantastic supervisor, Robert Hind, who started off as my sternest critic, came to Gombe, said he learnt more about animal behavior in the 2 weeks he was there than in all the rest of his life put together, and was able to help me learn how to write about my observations in a scientific way. Mind you, we didn't have computers back then. I mean, I'm really speaking to you from another era. We use slide rules. Most students today will have the faintest idea what a slide rule is. And so it was all this hard work, but also learning how to express myself so that I couldn't be torn to pieces by my erudite colleagues. And I'll give you one example of his clever thinking, because it served me in good stead throughout all that period of my life. He said, Jane, in this chapter you've written for your thesis, you say that Fifi was jealous when other youngsters came and tried to touch her baby brother. You can't say that. You don't know and you cannot prove that she was jealous. So I said, no, I can't prove it, but I do know it. So how shall I put it then? He said, I suggest you say, Fifi behaved in such a way that if she'd been a human child, we would say she was jealous. Now that is extremely clever, and I've shared that with many students. At any rate, it's pretty clear when you think about these similarities between chimps and humans that since that time, the line between us has blurred. And in so many ways, they show similarities to us. The biological similarities are quite spectacular. So chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans are equidistant from each other in the composition of the DNA. And chimps and bonobos differ from us by just over 1%, that's all. We're 98 plus similar in the composition of our DNA with our closest living relatives. We share postures and gestures of communication, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another on the back, swaggering, shaking the fist, begging. And it was fascinating to me over the years to watch the development of relationships between family members and to see how a female has her first child about 13, then not the next baby for 5 years. Very strong bonds developing in that 5 years between mother and child. Next baby is born. 5-year-old child doesn't move away, still completely emotionally dependent on the mother, stays with her and young brother or sister all the time. Bonds getting closer with mother, bonds developing between brothers and sisters. And even at 10 years, the child is still spending a lot of time with the mother, particularly the females. And so this was very fascinating. And also to see that just as in human society, there are good mothers and bad mothers. And the offspring of the good mothers who are protective but not overprotective, who can impose discipline, who are patient, who are affectionate, who are playful, and above all, who are supportive, who will run in to protect their child, even though that may lead them into difficulties. And those offspring have tended to do better. The more efficient mothers, they tend to rise higher in the male hierarchy if they're sons. And this is being analyzed now, actually. All the back notes are being computerized. The data will be available to primatologists around the world. So that was fascinating to see. And also the fact that chimpanzees actually have their own primitive cultures. And if a culture is defined as behavior passed from one generation to the next through observational learning, then we see infants watching carefully, for example, the tool-using behavior of the adults and gradually learning that skill. And we now know in different parts of Africa, there are completely different tool-using behaviors, and these two passed from one generation to the next through observational learning. It was a big shock to find out about this violent and brutal behavior, these brutal interactions between neighboring communities, showing that chimpanzees, like us, have a dark side to their nature. But again, like us, they also have a loving and compassionate and altruistic side, as when a 14-year-old male adopted a 3-year-old infant who was on his own in the world. He didn't have an older brother or sister, and we thought he wouldn't make it because at 3, you're still suckling. you're beginning to be able to rely on solid foods. But spindle was not genetically related as far as we know. We could tell exactly today, but it didn't seem that he was related to Mel. He never traveled around with Mel's mother when she was alive, and yet he adopted this infant, allowed him to travel around on his back, shared his food when Mel begged, and most significantly supported him, removed him from dangerous situations if he got too close to socially roused males, even though he might get buffeted himself. They slept curled up in the same night nest. No question, spindle saved Mel's life. And so here we are with this blurred line between us and chimpanzees. But we have to say at this point, but there are differences. There are major differences too. And I could talk for a long time about the differences, but I want to pick out what to me is the most significant difference, and that's the explosive development of our intellect. So if you put the brain of chimp and human side by side, the anatomy is almost identical, but ours is bigger. So what led to this explosive development of our intellect? I think it's tied up with the development of language, because chimpanzees communicate with many different sounds, postures, and gestures, but as far as we know, it's not possible for them to think about the past and use it to plan the present. As far as we know, they can't plan the distant future. The immediate future, yes, what should we do now? But not the distant future, 10 years' time. And they cannot teach their young about things that aren't actually present. And above all, they can't have discussions. So we can do all those things. And particularly when we discuss, we can bring people together from different disciplines, different skill sets, and discuss a problem and maybe come up with a solution. And I think that's pushed us to develop our intellect. At any rate, for whatever reason, here we are with this highly developed intellect, which brings me to such an important question, and that is, how is it possible that this creature, us, we humans, with this highly developed intellect, are destroying our only home? This planet Earth, there may be another offering similar kinds of environment somewhere out there. We don't know, and we are not likely to know, at least in our lifetimes. So I think somehow one of the things that's happened is that we've lost wisdom that was often associated with the Aboriginal people. You make a decision today only after a big decision, that is, only after thinking, how will this affect our people generations ahead? And we're tending to make decisions which, how will this benefit me now? How will this benefit the next shareholder meeting 3 months ahead? How will this affect my next political campaign? Those are the kind of criteria we're using. And I think that this is causing many of the problems that we see today. We also have become very materialistic. We know we need money to live. Unfortunately, too many people are living for money, and that's different. And we're also becoming disconnected from nature. We're doing more and more electronically, where it's been shown that we need to be out with the trees and the birds and the flowers. And we know that deprivation of this can cause many psychological problems. Conversely, people with some psychological problems can be cured by exposure to nature. That's what very often happens to people who've been traumatized in some of these ethnic conflicts in Africa, and they're sent, well, the ones I know, to England. And one woman who'd seen her child's head cut off in front of her and then been raped, she arrived completely traumatized, but gradually, as she watched a little bud open and become a rose and named it for her child, she began to come out of this awful trauma. So we're doing a lot of things wrong in the world. And, you know, people have said, why did you leave Gombe? You say you had that best time of your life there. and it was magic. So why did you leave? I left because at a big conference in the mid-80s, I realized, well, it brought together all the different people studying chimpanzees across Africa. Not so many back then. I think there were about 8 groups of people. And in each field site, there was horrifying slides of habitat destruction. There were pictures of the beginning of the bushmeat trade. And there was a session on conditions in captivity, secretly filmed footage of our closest living relatives in 5-foot by 5-foot cages. And they were being subjected to all kinds of terrifying procedures. Why? Because their bodies are so like ours. Biologically, they're so like us. And yet the scientists at that time, the mid-80s, were still refusing to admit the other similarities that I've been talking about. Similarities in intellect, emotion, personality, and so forth. And so I went to that conference planning to continue my wonderful life. Gombe, we had a research station, we had students, I had time to analyze the data, which I loved. I could write books, I did some teaching at Stanford University, I had a child. It was a fantastic life. And when I went to that conference, I was fully expecting to carry on at least for a while longer. But I left as an activist without making any conscious decision. I had to do it. And so that led to a very different kind of set of experiences. Flying over Gombe soon after that, knowing there was deforestation outside the park, but not expecting to look down on a little island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. Realizing there were more people there than the land could support, people too poor to buy food from elsewhere, the soil over-farmed and infertile, people struggling to survive. And that's when it hit me. We can't even try to save these famous chimpanzees of Gombe unless we help to improve the people's lives who are living as their neighbors. That led to our program we call Take Care, or Takari. It's the first of the Jane Goodall Institute programs of this sort to alleviate poverty around chimpanzee habitats. And a very successful project it became, and it still is. It involved sending a team of Tanzanians, local Tanzanians, into the 12 villages around Gombe to listen to what the people felt we could do to help them. Well, to grow more food. That meant restoring fertility to the overused land, no chemical pesticides or fertilizers used. And then they were gradually able to grow more food. And they wanted better health facilities. They wanted better education for their children. We worked with Tanzanian authorities. We had a small grant from the European Union for 3 years. And because it was a pilot, because really nobody else back then was doing anything like this. And the grant was renewed. So we were able to do it for another 3 years. And as the villagers came to trust us, we introduced other projects which we thought would be beneficial, such as water projects, restoring the flow in the streams that had become clogged up with soil washed down through erosion as the forested slopes were cleared. And then the most important, I think, program that we introduced was microcredit, based on Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank. Groups of women, with 2 men if they wished to join, applying for small grants, very small grants, for projects that had to be environmentally sustainable. And so this began to change the outlook of the women. And we provided family planning information, which was well received. And we provided as many scholarships as we could. We're still trying to provide more to keep girls in school after puberty, when so often they leave because they don't have hygienic latrines or privacy or anything like that. And it's been shown all around the world that as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. And that is very important in many parts of the world today. So that program began to work very well. We have the similar sort of program in 5 other African countries now. But, you know, traveling around Africa, as I did after that changing conference, and realizing the enormous problems faced right across Africa. And first of all, there's the deforestation, leading to erosion, leading to desertification. There's the shrinking surface freshwater supplies. There's the terrific poverty. There's ethnic violence. There's loss of biodiversity. Species are vanishing. And so I began to realize that not all of these problems, of course, but some of them seem to relate to the old colonial days when white people went into Africa, followed by Asian people, and began removing natural resources and leaving the people mostly poorer. And that in so many cases today, again, not all of them, but many multinationals are doing exactly the same sort of thing. They're going in, extracting Africa's natural resources and leaving people poorer. So then I thought, well, really, I need to travel around the rest of the world talking about all these problems, learning more and more. I wish I didn't know what I know about what's going wrong in the planet. But it's shocking what we're doing to this planet. We're destroying it day by day by day. There's the terrible pollution, the pollution of land with particularly agricultural chemicals, for pesticides, for fertilizers, for herbicides. There's the genetically modified plants that are also destroying the environment. There is the runoff from the rain, washing these chemicals into the streams, and eventually some of them ending up in the ocean. So we're polluting land, air, and water. We're recklessly burning fossil fuels, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, both by deforestation and by the reckless burning of fossil fuels, use of coal, and so forth. And, of course, we now have climate change. And I've heard many biologists stand up and give lectures in which they say it doesn't matter what we do today, we can't ever stop climate change getting worse and worse and worse. It's a very gloomy picture that they paint. And climate change is affected enormously, far more than most people understand, by the fact that as countries around the world, like China and other Asian countries and Latin American countries, as they get richer, one of the things that happens is that they tend to eat more meat. So much meat is eaten. You all know about intensive farms. I've been passing your cows out in the fields where cows should be. But as more and more and more cattle and pigs and livestock, poultry and so forth are being consumed, so I've seen with my own eyes how places like Argentina, where the cattle are still grazing, but they're moving further and further and further into forested areas. Forests are being reduced to woodlands and eventually to savanna. And so this is, again, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Huge areas of forest are cut down to grow grain to feed all these livestock. And there's another thing. I carry cow around with me. Cow was given to me about 2 years ago, and I was going to give her away to a child. And then, no, cow is my spokesperson for abused farm animals. And I don't know how many of you have seen into an intensive farm or an abattoir, but if you have, you probably had nightmares like I did. And so one of the other drawbacks of all this meat eating is, food goes in here and gas comes out the other end. And with cows, it's in the shape of burps. They burp a lot as they digest. And that gas is methane. Methane is more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And if you don't care about the condition of the animals or the environment, maybe you care about your own health. And one of the frightening things is that to keep these animals alive in these intensive farms, they're fed antibiotics routinely, not because they're sick, but to try and keep them healthy in these hellholes. And so as the antibiotics get out in the environment, bacteria are building up resistance. There's a whole book written about this. People are dying from an infected scratch because the doctors can't find an antibiotic that can cure this. And I read a headline in the British newspaper about 5 months ago saying I can't remember what he's called, but the top surgeon in the UK announces the era of the antibiotic is ending. That's frightening. So all of these things, all of these problems, and we can sum it up in 3 major problems. 1 is the crippling poverty. 2 is the unsustainable lifestyles of so many of us, having much more than we need, not thinking about our own environmental footprints. Just many people's case, it's just lack of understanding. Sometimes it's greed. Doesn't matter what it is draining away the natural resources as though they'll go on forever. But they won't, they're finite. And finally, there's the human population, still growing, although leveling off. It's going to go on growing. It's predicted 9 billion of us. And poor old planet Earth, that's what I say, we really are wreaking havoc on our only home. So not surprising, is it, that as I'm traveling around, I find young people who seem to have not much hope. And when I began talking to them, they seem to be either apathetic, not really caring much about anything, some of them really depressed, some of them angry. And why are you feeling apathetic or depressed or angry? Well, because you older generations, you have harmed our future. You've compromised our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. When I think what we've done to planet Earth since I was a child, I feel deep shame. Is it too late? As I've said, some biologists feel it is too late, but I think we've got a window of time. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I continue to wish to think it. And as people's awareness grow around the world, I become more and more hopeful that we can get the kind of change in attitude that we need if we care about future generations. Do we care about our children? Do we care about our grandchildren? I suspect we do. It's just that we haven't tied our action today to their future tomorrow. So going back to the young people I was meeting, this is why I started the Jane Goodall Roots and Shoots program. And it began with 12 high school students in Tanzania. They met from 9 different schools on my veranda to talk about the problems that concern them in the world around them. And as we talked through these things, I said to them, they wanted me to solve all the problems. And I said, well, I do love Tanzania, but I'm not a Tanzanian. But you are, you 12, you are all Tanzanians. They were 18, 19, 20, that age. And so I said, go back to your schools, find other people who have the same concerns or similar, and then we'll meet together. So we had a big meeting. And from that meeting, this program was born. And the chimpanzee, in a way, was the center, because the chimpanzee was joining the world of humans with the world of non-human animals. And we all needed the environment. So from the beginning, it was a program which was concern for people, for other animals, and for the environment we all share, with a theme of we must learn to live in peace and harmony, not only with each other, between nations, between rich and poor, between young and old, between ethnic groups, between nations, but also between us and the natural world. That's why I was made a UN messenger of peace, because of this message, this attempting to break down the barriers that we love to build between all these different factions. And so a core message of Roots and Shoots is that every individual matters, including individual animals, and that every individual, every one of us makes some difference every single day. And we have a choice as to what kind of difference we're going to make. That's the core message of Roots and Shoots. And what began with 12 high school students in Tanzania has now reached 130 countries around the world. We have members even in preschool, very strong in all the other grades, very strong in university. And it's, I think, my greatest hope for the future. These young people choose themselves. We don't tell them what to do. We just tell them, or sometimes it's their teacher, that they need to do between them 3 projects, one to help people, one to help animals, one to help the environment. They choose what to do, and they're going to choose something which is important to them. And it will be different if they live in Abu Dhabi or Bangladesh or the Netherlands. And it will be different if they're kindergarten or university. And it will be different if they're wealthy or living in poverty. But they all choose their 3 projects. The variety is amazing. There's a DVD which you can buy outside called Jane's Journey. It was a theatre film, and there's a whole beautiful section of Roots and Shoots in that DVD, if anyone's interested. There's also the rootsandshoots.org website, which tells you an awful lot. It's, as I say, my biggest reason for hope. And my other reasons for hope, first of all, this brain. We've talked about the brain, we've talked about our intellect. You've only got to drive down a street in the Netherlands, or drive through the country in the Netherlands, and before long you see a windmill. You were known for windmills. You invented windmills, I think, but now we've got a different kind of windmill that's providing green energy. And there are so many innovations. I keep hearing about new ones that can help us to live in greater harmony with nature, that can begin to undo some of the harm that we've done. I just heard this morning about an incredible invention of a 21-year-old, which has taken him years to perfect, but when it's done, and he's got money from Bill Gates and all sorts of people, it has great arms out in the ocean, and it's based on where the currents go and where the winds and the tides go, and it will slowly gather up and swallow all the plastic that's out there. And it will be taken away in boats, and more plastic will be gathered, because you all know the horror of these huge, huge, huge areas of plastic floating about in the ocean. So there's our human brain. And if we can just get back wisdom, and if we can just use not just our brain, but our hearts too. Because I think this lack of wisdom is somehow a disconnect between this clever, clever brain and the human heart, which is love and compassion. So the next reason for hope is the resilience of nature. Best example I can give right now, I talked about the devastation of the hills around Gombe. Now that we've been doing our Takari program for years, it's a very, very different landscape. You don't see bare hills anymore. And around Gombe itself, those 12 villages where we began, they've put aside land for conservation around the tiny national park. And the chimpanzees have 3 times more forest now than they had when I flew over those bare hills. The resilience of nature. The forests come back, the animals are living in the forest, and it's a buffer between the chimpanzees and the villagers. We are working down in the south, further south from Gombe, where the remaining wild chimpanzees are, other than Gombe. We're working on a corridor, joining the isolated Gombe chimps, because they became isolated, with other remnant groups. Last year, we had the first female come in from outside using this corridor. Really exciting that was, bringing in new genes, new hope for the future. And Down in the south, where the forest is still in many parts intact, we're using the same methods to protect the forest, restoring here, protecting there, and doing this in other parts of Africa as well. So we're also seeing today wonderful stories of animals on the very brink of extinction being given another chance. So the last but one book I did was called Hope for Animals and Their World. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, every single chapter is so inspirational. It's about, animals that wouldn't be here but for certain people, and now they've got a second chance. So if we can protect the habitats from which they came, or where the last few remain, then they have another chance. But we've got to work awfully hard. When I was young, elephants, rhinos roamed across Africa and Asia, tigers roamed across Asia. They're disappearing. They're disappearing very, very fast. Elephants because of their ivory, rhino because of their horns, because of misguided belief in the power of the rhino horn, and because of the enormous value that is set upon ivory today, the huge amounts of money that are paid. And because of corruption, this is escalating. It's very, very fast indeed. It is very frightening. But hope. If it can be done for some animals, it can be done for others. The next reason for hope is one I discovered quite recently, and that's the power of the social media. And I discovered this when I was taking part in the climate march in New York. They expected 100,000 people, maybe if they were lucky. They got up to 400,000 before the police had to stop more people arriving because there was no room for them. It was because of social media. I was there, I saw it, I talked to the people. They were tweeting and twittering, and they were using Facebook to call their friends and saying, come and join us, this is neat. There was a whole bunch of actors there. Come and see it, nice day. And people were coming. And it was happening all over the world on that one day. Social media was bringing thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out in support of doing change for the climate. We have to do more than march. But at least it showed the number of people who were caring, and it showed the power of social media. And then my last reason for hope is what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle seemingly impossible tasks and won't give up. And some of them are iconic. Nelson Mandela, he was 27 years in jail. He was 19 years hard physical labor in a lime quarry. And yet, when he was freed, he had this amazing ability to forgive, and he could lead his nation out of the evil regime of apartheid without a bloodbath. Are there problems in South Africa? Yes, like there are everywhere in the world today, but there wasn't the bloodbath that we all predicted. And then there are other people too tackling seemingly impossible tasks. I have to say there are unbelievably courageous and brave people risking their lives, even being prepared to give up their lives to try and get to the bottom of the corruption that is leading to the extinction of elephants and rhinos. And I know some of these people. They are truly remarkable. They need help. We have to do our bit, whatever it may be, even if it's just making a donation to a cause, helping the rangers families. So, these are some of the amazing, indomitable spirits. And the last person I introduce is Mr. H. Some of you have seen him before. And Mr. H was given to me 25 years ago by a man called Gary Horn, which is why he's Mr. H. And Gary Horn went blind when he was 21. For some peculiar reason, he decided to be a magician. Everybody said, Gary, how can you be a magician if you're blind? He said, well, I can try. So he does shows for children. He arranges his props beforehand on the table, and at the end of it, he'll tell them he's blind. Some of them don't believe it, but he is. And he says to them, something might go wrong in your life. You never expect it, but it can happen. And I'm telling you, if it does, don't give up. There's always some way forward. And he thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee for my birthday, and I made him hold the tail. I said, Gary, you know chimpanzees don't have tails. You've got no excuse, even though you can't see it's the wrong color. He said, well, never mind, take him where you go, and you know my spirit's with you. So Mr. H and I have been to 60 countries together. He's extremely famous, and so I think he's been touched by about 4 million people, because I tell them the inspiration rubs off. He does get bathed. If any of you buying a book want to touch him, he'll be there. He is not infectious. Even though I've just come back from Africa, I can assure you he's perfectly pure. So anyway, those are the messages I have for you tonight. And you know, the last thing I would say is to thank everybody who's made it possible for me to be with you tonight, those people at the university, those of the Jane Goodall Institute in the Netherlands, the volunteers, including members of the board of directors, and our one staff, Diederik, who really has far too much work to do, and everybody else who's helped to make this evening possible, and that's every single one of you who are here. And remember what I said, every single one of us makes a difference, every single day. And I think being here today is some difference that you have made, at least in my life. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much for that most inspirational lecture. We will have time now for questions from you, from the audience. First, I'll do a very short interview because I want to give you a lot of time. Listening to your message of hope and inspiration, I was wondering, have you ever been without it, without hope?
I've had moments of deep gloom and despair, like when 4 of my students were kidnapped from Gombe, and we didn't even know where they were. And that, as you can imagine, was a desperate time. And after the students returned, it was very unclear whether Gombe could continue. But I decided it should continue, so it did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also in this world of ours that is in crisis, ecological, of course, but also you mentioned the elephants. I just read a few weeks ago that in Tanzania, in the Ruaha Park, I think, more than half of the elephants had been killed.
Yes.
Are these moments that you get desperate as well? That we don't
I get very upset. I love elephants. Rhinos are in an even worse situation, I think, because there's fewer of them. I get angry. I would like to be the sort of activist that goes out and, you know, I would like to do horrible things to the people.
Yeah.
Not so much the actual poachers, the Africans who go and shoot the elephant, although that's horrible. But, you know, they're so poor and very often they do it for money. I want to go after those monstrous, corrupt people who are high up people in governments, high up in the police. And very often people know who they are. these people I mentioned, ones who go undercover, they're risking their lives. And so you have to uncover the corrupt people in the African or Asian countries who are enabling the export, but you also have to go after the, the problems in the countries where there is demand. And that's where our Roots and Shoots program is making quite an effort. In China, we have over 1,000 groups, and although that's nothing with the size of China, we do have a lot of the more wealthy children in the schools where we operate. So, we're doing the best difference we can. And we did make a big difference with the anti-shark's fin. The Roots and Shoots groups in China and Hong Kong and Singapore made big activation against shark's fin soup.
Yeah. So that is what gives you a lot of hope.
Yes.
Yeah, the kids or youngsters, yes. At the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned a very special person, I think, in your life as well. Not only your mother, but also Flo. And I read somewhere that you actually learned from her when you first became a mother yourself. Well, what did you learn from her?
I don't know. I brought up my child. I think actually my mother treated us very much the way Flo treated her children. Okay. And at that time, Dr. Spock was very well known, and I read Dr. Spock, and he had some jolly good ideas. He went out of fashion, but actually had some very good ideas. So I think I raised my child with a mixture of Flo, the patience. What I really learned from the chimp mothers is the importance of having fun with your baby. I thought, gosh, these chimp mothers, they have such fun. They're tickling and playing with the babies and laughing. I'm going to have fun with mine, and I did.
Yeah, so that's what you took from her. And you were very close with these animals, chimpansees, that are, of course, very close to you. That's probably the reason why you can spread this message of hope, because you're very attentive to them. Do you think that if you would have studied donkeys or lizards, that it would have been the same?
I don't think the chimpanzees have had anything to do with hope. Whatever I'd been studying, I don't know about donkeys, but anything out in the wild would have taught me about habitat destruction and, these sorts of things. Chimpanzees were useful in that they are very attractive. I was the first one to find out things about their lives in the wild. So that gave, that put me in a position where I could develop a voice that would become more useful. Whether that would have happened with lizards, I don't know.
No. Well,
I didn't study lizards.
We'll probably never know. There are, of course, a lot of people who think that the way to protect animals should be animal rights. You are not really keen on those animal rights. Why is that? Why don't you think it would greatly help them if they would be considered persons?
Well, okay, so you would agree that we have human rights.
Yeah.
And almost all countries have signed on to the human rights. In most of those countries, those rights are not really very well upheld. Human rights hasn't helped hundreds of thousands of people in the world today. So would animal rights really do more for animals than human rights do for humans? It wouldn't hurt. I'm not against animal rights at all. In fact, I support some of the movements. It would possibly be helpful to animals in captivity like chimps in medical research. But animal rights people, unfortunately, sometimes tend to be a bit violent, and that doesn't help.
Yeah.
At the beginning, I think it did, because it caused attention. You had to do something dramatic, like breaking into a lab to expose what was going on inside. But people know now, and there are photographs and there are films, and we can talk about it. And so that's been my way. Whether it's the right way or the wrong way, it's not my way to become violent and abusive and confrontational like that. I'd rather sit down and talk with people, get into their heart. I've found if you can get into somebody's heart, you've got the beginning of a way to start change. And by attacking them, by being abusive, you will never get into their heart.
Yeah. So also we should get into the hearts of animals as well, if we really want to help them, being very attentive and not trying to get them right, just.
Well, let the people who want them to have rights get them rights, and maybe it certainly won't hurt them, and it can help. But it's just that I want to devote my time to getting people to understand who and what animals are, that they feel pain, that they have personalities, that they have emotions, and to respect them.
Yeah, and that certainly has changed, because when you started, people didn't think they were individuals, and I think everybody here now thinks, of course, all animals, well, maybe not flies. Maybe even flies.
Maybe even flies.
Maybe even flies, yeah.
And one real sign of hope today for me is Pope Francis. Pope Francis announced that animals have souls and can go to heaven. Pope Francis said to 6 million people in Manila, just because we can breed like rabbits doesn't mean we should. That is amazing that a pope has the guts to say something like that.
Yeah. I want to go to the, I think, 1,300 people over here. Maybe not all of you, and give you the opportunity to ask a question. So we'll start at the back, you in the white. Yes.
Thank you so much. I had a question when you mentioned the point about language, distinguishing chimps and humans. And I'd like to get your perspective on how the language of emotion that you notice in the chimps is different from the language of words and, planning ahead and all that. If you noticed an emotional language and then a verbal language as two different types of language, that chimps have one but not the other.
Well, we have the non-verbal communication just the same as the chimpanzees. We have the same sort of emotions. We have these similar gestures, kissing, embracing. We have a lot of calls that you can equate to human calls, like screaming and laughing, which are about the same. But although chimpanzees can be taught sign language, the language used by deaf people in America, American Sign Language, chimpanzees have learned 400 signs or more. They can use them to some extent among themselves, although they mostly don't. Like if you had 4 Dutch people together, they'd probably speak Dutch rather than English, even if they understood English. So these chimpanzees, can use words in the right context. They can ask for things. But as far as we know, without this language which we've given them and taught them, they can't do those things. How can you discuss the past without a spoken language, unless you're thinking of telepathy?
Yeah, thank you. I go to you now because the microphone is very close.
I'd like to ask you the next question. There is a lot of comparison, human beings, chimpanzees, and you spoke about the intellect. It's not a security for a good future, but we still hope. And I will ask you another question. I think we humans can learn a lot from chimpanzees. And I like to ask you what we can learn, and to get more hope for the future, what can we learn from the chimpanzees? What did you discover?
Well, I don't think we can learn hope for the future from them exactly. I think that chimpanzees, for me anyway, have helped me to understand better who we are. Because we're so similar in so many ways, then you start thinking about how we're different. And you think about, how did we get there? What happened in the past? And where are we going in the future? And as I've said already twice, that I think that, the development of the human intellect is what makes us most different. And out there in the wild, the chimps have their dark side. They kill each other. They can be cannibals. They're so like us in so many ways. I don't even think of them as animals, not animals. We're animals too, but we don't think about ourselves as animals. I feel the same about chimpanzees. You've got a human being and a chimpanzee being, and I hope the day will come when we don't think of a dog as a dog, but a dog being. I mean, an individual, somebody that we should respect and who has meaning in his own right.
Hello, Jane. First of all, just I think in the name of everyone, thank you for what you are, for what you've done.
Thank you.
And for a very, very moving talk. I have maybe one very quick remark, just another thing about hope. I'm sure you're aware of a recent development, I believe a few weeks ago, that I believe chimpanzees in America or Canada received a habeas corpus, so they actually received legal rights of a human being. And just a week ago I saw a Facebook post about New Zealand acknowledging animals as being sentient beings. Yep. So I think we're very, very lucky living in this time. I think there's some big shifts going on, so that gives me at least a lot of hope.
Yep. Yep.
I am very, very curious about some thoughts. You just mentioned dogs. I think in the wild chimpanzees are closest to us, but there's more and more breakthroughs about dogs being close to us emotionally, spiritually. I'm just very curious if you have any kind of experience, if you could do a little comparison between what you find similarities between chimpanzees people and dogs people relationships.
No, not really. I mean, the same sort of similarity between chimps and humans, that's very obvious. There's no real obvious similarities between people and dogs. We do have a bond with them, that's true. We've domesticated them for years. So, you know, you can't really make comparisons like that, I don't think. But I do love dogs. They're my favorite animal.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we get a microphone there in the middle? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm good enough.
You will be.
I am very proud to have seen you, to have listened to you, that you're here in this beautiful building. And from when I was very young, and I'm old now, I've been wanting to meet you because I once had a baby chimp in my arms, cuddling him or her, playing with it. And it was the best thing that ever happened in life. Thank you very much for coming.
Overlooking anyone at the back? No, not yet. So I'll go to you in the black.
Hello, Jane. I have a question because humans had a very large and explosive development in the last few hundred years. Do you think or hope that chimpanzees will make the same or another explosive growth? If you understand what I mean.
Do you understand that?
Sorry, you mean an explosive growth from another species?
Like humans were in a small time from the apes till now, and do you think or hope that the chimpanzees now will be in developed? Sorry.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, okay.
I understand what you mean. I think it's extremely unlikely that this will happen because we've so interfered with the normal movements between groups. Chimpanzee populations are now isolated, and remember, it was 6 million years ago when we and chimps shared a common ancestor, and I suppose they might change, but I don't think they'd change in the direction that we took. I would hope that if they do change, that they would be relying more on the right brain than the left brain, because that's what's gone wrong with us. But I don't know.
Ja.
Zou je het voor mij willen vertalen?
Ja, natuurlijk. Of course I will. Ja.
Nou, als ze met de apen die ze vroeger heeft gewerkt, als die nu nog zou tegenkomen, zou die aap haar dan vertrouwen?
Okay, so that boy is asking if you would meet a chimpanzee now that you knew earlier, would he or she still trust you? Would he know you?
You mean the chimps of Gombe?
Yes, so het gaat je om de apen die zij gekend heeft, toch? De chimpansees?
Ja.
Yes, the chimps that you knew and that knew you.
Well, I can tell you for an absolute fact that chimpanzees recognize people they know after 13 years. We don't know longer, I suspect longer, but that's an absolute proof that chimpanzees can remember somebody for 13 years. That was a captive chimp. I've been going back to Gombe twice a year, always. So there are very few chimpanzees left today that I knew really well in those early days. I don't know them anymore. But the few that do still remain, then they recognize me and I recognize them.
It's very worthwhile talking about this. And I also have a question. You are making a big difference in the world today. What do you suggest for us to do? How can we make a difference in the world to do today?
Well, the point is that, if I've understood you, every one of us makes a difference. I mean, you can't go through a day without, doing something that makes a difference. Just eating and drinking and what you eat makes a difference. So if you eat a lot of meat, you're encouraging climate change. And you alone wouldn't make any difference at all. But you're not alone. There are millions of us now. There are billions of us now. And so many people think, well, what I do can't make a difference. I'm just me. It won't make a difference if I turn a light off. It won't make a difference if I walk rather than driving a car. It won't make a difference, But it wouldn't if it was just you. But if there are several billion people turning lights off and several billion people walking or cycling, 7 billion people giving just $3 to an organization, it starts to make a difference. So I often say to the children, they say, well, we don't know what to do, we don't have any money. And I say, well, try and do something to earn $1. Give JGI $1. And if enough children give JGI $1 or $0.50 or a euro or whatever currency you have, that adds up to a huge, huge, huge amount of money. So we just have to think, and when I say we have a choice, you have a choice to do these things. You can think about what sort of ecological footprint will you leave? A heavy one? Or will you try to make it lighter? And what I find with some people is they start off thinking like that, and then gradually they make bigger changes. So the best example I have is a man who came to my lecture. I didn't hear anything of him for 3 years. When I met him 3 years later, he said, after your lecture, I decided I didn't need that big house I was living in. I sold it, and I've now got a much smaller one, and I think my environmental footprint is much smaller. Thank you. I have another example which happened twice, once in Taiwan and once in the United States, no, 3 times, and once in Holland, where these 3 men were going off to buy expensive cars. They all, how, well, women too, but men have love affairs with cars. And the one in Holland, for example, was going to buy a sports Ferrari. He'd always wanted a sports Ferrari. And he came to my lecture, we had dinner, and he was driving home and he thought, damn Jane. And not only did he not buy the sports Ferrari, but he gave the money he would have paid for it to JGI Netherlands.
Wow.
That was very nice.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Neglecting this upper side, so I'll start 2 questions over here because I promised that, and then to that lady over there with the hand very high. I see it. So I'll get to you. Okay, so first, yes, you at the back. And yes? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
I have a question about GMOs, so genetically modified organisms, and I would like to ask, so you criticize them in your talk, and so what exactly are you criticizing about them? So I think it's probably certain practices, not the thing or the idea per se, maybe. It would be nice if you could clarify. For example, wouldn't it be a nice thing if we could engineer them in a way that they use less that plants need less pesticides or fertilizers?
Well, the problem is that so far this hasn't happened. And the problem is that if you take I mean, I know quite a lot about this, more than I wish. And if anybody's interested in a short, concise, I'm sorry, I keep trying to sell my books, but get it from a library, borrow it from a friend. I'm not asking you to pay money. But it's called Seeds of Hope, and there's a whole chapter about GMOs. And, you know, to give one example, every single animal test, because they test them on animals, that's been evaluated by the industry, have said, well, there's a few little changes, but they're not statistically significant. If the same results are examined by an independent outside scientist, they find pretty shocking harm to the animals being tested, mostly the poor old laboratory rat. One scientist in France. Yeah, one scientist.
Some sort of Freudian.
Okay. Well, I'd been talking about the GMO scientist, but I wasn't. I was talking about somebody who said to himself, well, the tests that are done on animals are required to be 3 months. And you can't really test much in 3 months. Think of DDT, how long it took to learn, how many years it took to learn the cumulative adverse effect on the environment. It was years. So instead of doing tests for 3 months on genetically modified food, he did 2 years. He was actually criticized by animal rights people, quite rightly, really. But what happened to those rats who were fed for 2 years compared to the control group that was fed the same food that wasn't genetically modified, you would be shocked to see what happened to the rats, the size of the tumors they grew. It was horrifying. And most of the damage is to the liver and the kidneys. Now, if you come to the environment, the very famous thing done by Monsanto is to create a plant that is resistant to the herbicide. The herbicide is made by Monsanto, and it's called Roundup Ready. The plants were genetically modified so that you could spray them with this Roundup Ready, would kill the weeds all around, the agricultural weeds, but it wouldn't kill the plants that have been genetically modified to resist it. So it's turned out that this Roundup Ready was used more and more. It turns out to have horrifying effects on bees and other insects. And what about all this plant remains which has that herbicide inside of it, which get left in the ground? I can't give you too many examples. The thing that's repeated again and again and again and again is we need genetically modified food to feed the billions of people we can expect in the future. But if you read about it, you will find the results show that it's not the case, that they haven't fed more people. Sometimes it's been a failure, and that the way for the future is smaller family farms, it's permaculture, things like that. But, you know, I can't, yeah. I have to say one more thing about that. One more thing is that the European Union has been keeping out almost all genetically modified foods, but they're about to have a debate, and it looks as though that ban is going to be lifted. It's definitely in the UK. We have to try and stop it. We do not want genetically modified food grown here the way they are in the US. In the US, it's not even, you don't even know when you buy food whether it's got GM in it because there's no labeling required. And every time people demand that they should know what they're eating, Monsanto particularly, puts in, the last time it was $48 million into a campaign to oppose the labeling of GMOs in food. It's frightening.
You were talking about the social media impact, and I was wondering, what do you think about crowdfunding? Because the project you mentioned about the ocean cleanup, that was actually crowdfunded. I was one of the crowdfunders, so I'm quite proud of that. But do you think that people now have more of an impact? So do you think that crowdfunding has more of an impact because people can actively participate and give money to projects that they actually support?
I think crowdfunding is fantastic. I really do. And there are a lot of projects out there now with crowdfunding that I think have worked really, really well. And that the more that people contribute to things they're passionate about, the more involved they get, the more awareness is spread, and the more people can help. So yes, I think it's very good.
Thank you.
I speak slowly. Can you hear me, Jane?
You're very well.
Yeah, okay. Hello. Thank you very much for coming here. I really am moved by this, that you travel all around, and I know it takes a lot of energy. Thank you for that. I want to ask you about dreams. I've been a dream therapist, and I know that dreams are very important for our growth and our digesting of things that happen in the daytime. Have you noticed chimpansees having nightmares when they had this abusing of one group abuses the other group? Did you notice any difference in the dreams when they were sleeping? Like we see the cats and the dogs at night, we see them moving their legs and we see that they're dreaming. Have you noticed anything about dream behavior?
Well, unfortunately, the chimpanzees make nests high in the trees.
Well, I can see you being there. No,
I actually have had this discussion with people, who are looking after captive chimpanzees, and they say, well, we're not there at night. But it would be a fascinating thing to see perhaps chimpanzee dreams, like a little orphan who's been traumatized. Maybe somebody will pick it up one day. I love dreams. I record my dreams because they're so bizarre and so extraordinary and seem to be totally unrelated to anything that's happening in my life.
Yes, thank you so much.
Well, I'm curious, why do you record them anyway?
Because I'm so fascinated.
Yeah.
I recorded chimp behavior, and so this is a part of my subconscious that.
Yeah.
And I look back and I think, how weird.
But you don't analyze the dreams.
No, I don't analyze.
No. First of all, thank you very much. I'm a biologist at Radboud University, so thank you very much for showing up. My question is about the human dilemma you talked about. It's described by the fact that the human race has the most potential of every other great animal to make decisions for our world and to conserve it. But the question I have is related to a subject I had in university, and it's about, can knowledge, which should be positive as a fact on our world and its development, can be gained by knowledge achieved by university, or should it be achieved by experience made by our own? So everybody knows the fact when you're young and you're touching a hot plate of the oven and it's hot and you won't do it again. But if somebody talks about it, you probably will touch it anyway.
So thank you. In that personal experience or university?
The answer is we need both. Some people don't need to go to university. They don't want to. What they want out of life is nothing to do with what they would learn in a university. People who tie themselves up totally in an ivory tower certainly need to come out of that tower and get some personal experience to be a fully rounded human being. So we need both.
Thank you for your inspiration. The world is changing. A lot is happening. What can you say about leadership? What do next leaders need to lead us?
Well, leadership, if you're talking about political leaders, the world is filled with political leaders, I think, are not very good people. I think they start off good. There's a saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I've seen that happen in Africa many times. And, you know, there's a lot of people in political power around the world at the moment. The world would be better off if they were not political leaders. But there are other kinds of leaders that are very important. In our Roots and Shoots youth program, we have developed a program for Roots and Shoots youth leaders. These are mostly 18 to 24, but we also have a level of younger ones. And these are leaders in the true sense of leadership. They're doing great things, they're leading by example, they're sharing their knowledge, they're inspiring, they're encouraging. Those are the kind of leaders we need. And the problem is that politics are so tied up with money that it's very, very difficult. It's also, I think, a lot of the really good people who could be good political leaders. Well, if you go into politics, at least in the UK and the US, I don't know about Holland, so I'm not going to talk about Holland, but in the UK and the US, as soon as you get into a political leadership situation, every aspect of your previous life is analysed and laid out on a plate. So any decent person who's done something in the past, the revelation of which might be damaging to somebody he cares about, he doesn't want to go and have that exposed and splashed over the media. The media is responsible for a lot of damage.
In our neuroscience masters, we were invited to go visit a facility where they're testing deadly diseases on rhesus monkeys. I was on the fence about that when I went, and then after going, I found it to be a harrowing experience. What do you think we should do in the face of such a difficult moral dilemma, and what do you think are possible alternatives to testing on intelligent, sensitive creatures like that?
Well, it's a good question you bring up. I mean, I've been fighting the use of chimpanzees for years, and I'll tell you something which is very interesting. There was a brand new director of National Institutes of Health in the US, and when he took over, I happened to just have dinner beside him. It was just coincidence, I don't know, but I did. And he said, I mentioned the chimpanzees to him because the NIH at that time had about slightly more than 400 chimpanzees in their protocols. And I talked to him about it. He said, but Jane, I don't really know anything about chimps. And I said, well, you know, this is going on. And so he said, all right, I'll put together a committee to investigate and find out how many of these experiments are useful for humans. So that took 18 months. And do you know what the result was? There was not one single experiment being done on those 400 chimps that was the slightest use to human health. So he said that the chimps could be retired into sanctuaries. Well, unfortunately, some of the medical people said, yes, but we might need some in the future. So some chimps have been kept back, but I'm assured they'll be in better conditions. And when it comes to alternatives, I think you find that about 15 years ago, there were far, 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 far fewer alternatives than there are today. And I was talking to somebody this morning about this, who said that, you know, he'd been talking to a scientist in this field who said that these alternatives, they're using human cells, human bits and pieces of humans in Petri dishes. And actually the results of those are far more useful because it's actually human, like stem cell research and things like that. We should not be doing these horrible things to sentient creatures like monkeys when probably the results will not be useful. So many, you know, people have gone through all the testing of monkeys and animals and even rats and so forth, dogs and cats, and found that very little of that research was useful, but it brings in research dollars. I mean, how dare we take beautiful dogs like beagles and force them to inhale smoke when it was obvious that smoke was hurting human lungs? What can the possible reason be?
Last question. Yeah, could you give her the... Yeah.
Yes, thank you. My question is if you have worked together with Diane Fossey and if there is a similarity in your work.
I knew Diane Fossey quite well. We discussed our research quite often. We discussed ways in which she did things differently. And I think one problem with Dian Fossey is that she felt that if the local people followed the gorillas, they would be more susceptible to poaching. And my argument was that getting the local people involved and their villages involved would be more protection for the gorillas because people would understand them better. So I've always used Tanzanian field staff. And, you wouldn't get anybody poaching a chimpanzee there because they all know them and they know that they're sort of helping them in a way, certainly with our Tukari program. So I was sorry that she wouldn't listen to that approach. I think we should have one more question.
Yeah?
Because that was a sad note in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
So no question unless it's something positive.
Okay, we want a very, very... Have you got a positive question? Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's not exactly a question for Jane, but to the audience. First of all, I really want to thank you for emphasizing the destructive effect that consuming animal products have on our world. And someone asked, okay, well, what can we do? So if you could bring it upon yourselves, I would really ask you to maybe try not eat meat for 1 day a week. If you're a vegetarian, try maybe 1 day of veganism. And if you really like it, go vegan. It's the best thing you can do for your environment.
Thank you. But I want the actual last question, if you please. You said in the documentary you mentioned earlier, Jane's journey, that the most important thing is that we tell each other stories. And I think that's what you have been doing for years now, since 68, so almost 30 years. Could you share with us one more story, one story that gave you hope, that changed, and that we can take with us?
Well, are we showing the video clip? Yeah, well, rather than tell a story, let me show a story. It's 3 minutes. Can we do that? This is a really exciting moment for me. The Jane Goodall Institute's Chimpunga Chimpanzee Rehabilitation Center in the Republic of Congo has for years been caring for infants whose mothers were killed, mostly for the illegal bushmeat trade. Many of them are now fully grown. Recently, we acquired 3 large forested islands on the beautiful Kwilu River, where we can release many of the chimpanzees from our overcrowded center. In here is Wunda, and she nearly died, but thanks to Rebecca, she came back from the dead. And here she is about to come out into this paradise. She's the 15th chimpanzee to get her freedom here. And we hope ultimately to have about 60 on the island. Today is the first time I've met Wunda. I talked to her on the boat, trying to reassure her. She must have wondered what was happening. None of us could predict exactly what she would do once the cage door opened. It was a very, very touching moment. One of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me. The warmth of her embrace is something I shall never forget. For Wunda and all the other chimpanzees we're working to bring here, Chinzula Island will provide a wonderful forest home where they will be cared for and safe. So let me tell a little more of that story. I was in the Congo 3 days ago, and I went to visit Wunda. She's now with 30 other chimpanzees on one of the islands. She's a female, but she's managed to dominate a fully grown male. She is the dominant chimpanzee. She's part of a group that we hope we shall be able to put absolutely back into the wild. On the island, they have people to feed them once a day because there isn't enough food on the island. But the forest is beautiful, and they learn about various creatures and plants and things in the forest. And this sanctuary is the biggest in Africa for chimpanzees. We have more than 160, most of them coming in as orphans whose mothers were shot for the illegal bushmeat trade. So having these 3 islands given to us by the Congolese government it's really fabulous to get them out of the overcrowded sanctuary and onto these beautiful islands. And it will be an amazing day to see them one day move off into the wild, providing we know the habitat is safe, providing we will not be harming any chimpanzees living there, and providing we know that our chimpanzees will be safe from attack by any wild ones living there. So anyway, that's the story. And one of the programs we offer for anybody who wants to help is a Chimp Guardian program. And the little bit of money you pay, you get information about that chimpanzee 3 times a year and photographs. And I'm going to suggest that Wunda becomes one of the chimps people can choose to be the guardian of, because she's become so famous. And that little clip went viral all over the world. So thank you, Wunda, and thank you, Fernando, who filmed it, Rebecca's husband. So I think that's a lovely note to end on. Where we started with chimps, we end with chimps, chimps being shot, habitats being destroyed, but ending up with that story of hope.
Yeah. Jane Goodall, everybody.